Hello and welcome to our webinar titled Using NIRS to Optimize and Individualize Hypertrophy Training, presented by Evan Peikon from Training Think Tank. Evan has been using Moxy with CrossFit athletes for several years at Training Think Tank. As I mentioned earlier, he's one of our presenters at our 2017 Moxy Summit in Seattle. He's clearly a thought leader in this space. Evan has an online course called NIRS for the sport of fitness. I've mentioned that earlier. That's online on the Training Think Tank website, so be sure and check that out. For our format today, Evan has about a 30 to 40 minute presentation prepared. We're going to take a break about halfway through to take a couple of questions. So if you have questions, please submit them in the chat box. And then we will wrap up about, at the end of the presentation, we'll take additional questions and we'll wrap up about 50 minutes past the hour so that you do have an idea of our scheduled completion time. If we don't have time for all of the questions that get submitted live, Evan has agreed to answer those questions in writing on our forum. And again, I'll send a link to the forum post as soon as that's up. We'll get that up within about a day after the webinar's completed. And the webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will get an email to the link to the recording. So with that, I'll turn it over to Evan to begin the presentation.
Roger, are you guys on the slide page right now?
Yes, we're seeing your slides.
Okay, great. All right, so before we get started with this presentation, I want to kind of explain where this is coming from. So this is my best reconciliation of the current body of scientific literature on hypertrophy training specifically, real-world measurements taken with athletes over the past few years, and then observations working with a diverse group of coaches and athletes on site at Training Think Tank. So if after the talk anyone has any critiques or any kind of holes in the model that they see, I'd be more than happy to chat with them and try and make this less wrong over time. So before we get into why I believe NIRS is going to be a really valuable tool for hypertrophy training, I wanted to quickly go over some of the mechanisms of muscular hypertrophy and the genesis of ideas over the past few years in that field, just so we could all be on the same page.
Hey, Evan.
In 2010, Brad Schoenfeld wrote a paper titled The Mechanisms of Muscular Hypertrophy and Their Application to Resistance Training. And this paper presented a really comprehensive model of muscle growth, but it was very largely theoretical. So the paper tried to provide some comprehensive evidence for what a lot of people traditionally believed over the past few decades, which is that muscle damage, mechanical tension, and metabolic stress were the three primary causative factors for hypertrophy training. But in the past few years, some of these ideas have started to become challenged.
Hey, Evan.
So starting with mechanical tension,
can I break
when
in for a
we're
second?
talking about this, what we're really referring to is mechanotransduction, and that's where we take a mechanical stimulus, apply it to a tissue, and it's translated into a chemical signal. So the basic process of how mechanical tension leads to muscle growth is the process of myogenic signaling, which is going to signal the creation of muscle, and that's going to include IGF-1, IL-6, and a handful of other growth factors. mTOR signal integration, so we're taking that signal from that first step and initiating gene translation. Then muscle protein synthesis, which is the actual process where myofibrillar proteins are added to the tissue. Then myonuclear addition. That's a grossly oversimplified version of that model, but for our intents and purposes, we could keep that fairly brief.
Evan, could I break in for just a second? Could you expand your slides so that we can see the whole slide instead of just the speaker notes?
Oh, so you guys aren't able to. What are you guys viewing right now?
We're seeing a very small version of the slide with your speaker notes.
Okay, let me. So on this slide, I have a quote from Brad Schoenfeld, who wrote that 2010 paper, and it says the importance of mechanical tension promoting muscle growth is indisputable. So based on the current body of evidence, this is what we believe to be the primary cause of muscle growth. But muscle damage and metabolic stress are both going to be a little bit more contested. So going on to the two of these, and again, you can see this model going from this image to this one where we're slightly changing it as we get more information over time. So muscle damage is going to be the tearing of membranes, muscle fibers, and so forth. And traditionally, it was believed that muscles grow because they're damaged. And that's good to assume that the growth process involves a breaking down of muscle tissue and then building it back up as a result. So while muscle damage does correlate with muscle growth, that doesn't necessarily mean that it causes it. And we know this intuitively. We've all heard correlation doesn't imply causation. So what it appears is that muscle damage and hypertrophy are both consequences of a common cause, which is lifting weights and applying mechanical overload to a tissue. So when I first read the literature on this, I was really skeptical. And one of the first things that I thought to myself was, what about those increases in muscle protein synthesis we see after inducing muscle damage in the literature? And what it looks like is that this initial increase in muscle protein synthesis above baseline post-exercise when we induce a lot of muscle damage really just functions to repair and remodel the muscle, but it probably doesn't contribute to hypertrophy after we attenuate that damage. This is probably why we see huge spikes in muscle protein synthesis in studies when athletes do downhill running, but it doesn't really correspond to muscle growth. We also see in the literature that strength training protocols that don't promote muscle damage induce equal or greater levels of hypertrophy than those that do promote initial muscle damage. And that's going to suggest that in addition to it not being a prime contributor to hypertrophy, it might actually be counterproductive to an extent. Then we go on to metabolic stress. This one is a little bit more difficult, and its relationship to hypertrophy is quite a bit more complicated than either mechanical tension or muscle damage. And for one, this is just going to be due to the fact that it's really difficult to quantify metabolic stress, though I think NIRS could give us a really good proxy for doing that in applied practice. So rather than going into some of the mechanistic research and theory, I think it's easier and more applicable to look at the applied research on metabolic stress. So looking at a range of studies, we have a few different findings that we could kind of use here. One, when we look at a lot of the HIIT studies, which is high intensity interval training, we see that HIIT training induces a lot of metabolic stress, but it provides little muscle growth. And when we compare HIIT training to standard resistance training methods, where we equate volume between the two populations, HIIT training appears to be less effective for hypertrophy. Another thing that we see when we compare shorter rest intervals with longer rest intervals, and we equate volume between the two populations, which is a really important component to that study, is that the groups that perform shorter rest intervals get less hypertrophy as well. And again, short rest intervals are going to lend themselves to more metabolic stress than really long rest intervals. Another study we see, if we do have two people and they both do a set of curls and they push the set of curls to failure, and then at the end of the set, we apply a BFR cuff to one of the populations, they don't get more hypertrophy than the other group, even though there's more metabolic stress. And lastly, blood flow restriction in lieu of exercise doesn't promote an increase in protein synthesis, even though we see reduced muscle oxygenation. And I'll go into the reduced muscle oxygenation, how that ties in a little bit. So these findings are going to support the idea that metabolic stress is only anabolic in the presence of muscular contractions and mechanical tension. And this is why a lot of people refer to metabolic stress as a backdoor pathway to hypertrophy. And you can see here we have the model slightly changing based on some of the literature where metabolic stress is leading to mechanical tension, which leads to hypertrophy. Mechanical tension is leading to muscle damage. I kept the connection between these though, because I don't think we have enough evidence to fully rule those out and say that they don't contribute to hypertrophy at all. So we already discussed mechanical tension. That's going to be the primary cause for muscle growth, and then metabolic stress is probably a backdoor path, but I want to revisit that concept of metabolic stress through the lens of NIRS. So when I refer to metabolic stress for the rest of this talk, what I'm specifically going to be talking about is local muscle desaturation, which has been shown to increase muscle activation. So when we utilize oxygen at a faster rate than we're capable of delivering it to the working muscle, we're going to get an impairment in the sensitivity of actin myosin myofilaments to calcium ions. That impairment is going to drive peripheral fatigue. Peripheral fatigue is then going to cause an increase in motor unit recruitment, and that increase in motor unit recruitment leads to increases in mechanical tension. And that's in line with the observed oxygen conforming response that we see in the literature. So this might explain why we see higher than expected increases in motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension when we lift very light loads to failure. And it's also probably why we see loads ranging from 30% to 90% of an athlete's 1 rep max having the same ability to elicit hypertrophy when we equate volumes between those two groups. Another interesting observation is that there's a relationship between loading and local muscle desaturation, such that the heavier the load we use, the greater the magnitude of muscle desaturation we see. And we already know that heavier loads that are greater than, say, 70% of an athlete's 1 rep max on average have the ability to elicit arterial occlusion. And that might explain why we see heavy lifting causing maximum motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension off the bat. So in and of itself, local muscle desaturation still doesn't appear to cause hypertrophy, but we have a clear path of how it might lead to more mechanical tension, which is that primary driver. And that jives with all the previous observations that metabolic stress is only anabolic in the presence of muscular contractions. And in this model here, we have lifting within an effective intensity of 30 to 90%. If we're lifting on the up end of that, we're probably going to cause arterial occlusion, max motor unit recruitment off the bat. If we're lifting those very light loads to failure, we're going to have that left-hand side of the chart encompassing the process that's going to lead to hypertrophy. Right, so here I have the NIRS trend. This is actually an athlete that I ran a NIRS strength assessment on. So I had them start with an unloaded squat, and they built up in 10% increments of their 1 rep max. So we see at each subsequent load, doing only 3 to 5 reps at each load, they have lower and lower oxygenation at each intensity. The one exception to this is that 75% of their 1 RM, they paused for a few seconds, so they were able to get a little bit more oxygen into the muscle. But this idea is going to fall in line with that oxygen conforming response, which if anyone wants to read the slide later on, it's all explained here, and I have some of the literature on that cited as well. So if we accept that mechanical tension and local muscle fatigue are going to be the 2 primary drivers of hypertrophy, then any choice of training intensity that we use is going to represent the trade-off between both of those mechanisms. So the heavier you go, the more mechanical tension you're going to have off the bat and the less local muscle desaturation, and vice versa. The lighter you go, the more local muscle desaturation, metabolic stress you have, but the less mechanical tension, at least initially. Well, it seems like there probably needs to be a balance of those mechanisms to maximize muscle growth. So when I think about the relationship between training volume and intensity, I like to use the following analogy. So if we put water on a stove and we want it to boil, we wouldn't put the flame on the lowest setting because no matter how long we gave it, it would never reach a rolling boil. So instead we would set the flame to the appropriate intensity and then we would give it the time it needs to actually boil and work its magic. So when we're talking about hypertrophy training, the appropriate intensity is roughly going to be between 30 and 90% of an athlete's 1 RM. And based on the current body of literature, it appears that both of those intensities could provide the same stimulus if the set's taken to volitional failure. If that prerequisite is met, then it appears that volume, which we're going to define as the total number of work sets done within an effective intensity range, is going to be the greatest driver of muscle growth. Third, training-related factor is going to be training frequency, and that's going to be derived from training volume. So as volume gets higher, we probably need to drive frequency up in tandem with that to continue seeing gains and preventing a backslide. And I'm going to cover that one in detail later on. So now that we've gone over the basic mechanisms of hypertrophy as well as the main variables of control from a training standpoint, we're still left with some big gaps in the training literature. So in the endurance world, which is my initial training background, first, there were general training characteristics that people used way before I was involved in the sport. Then they started to use these bucket system models like the Jack Daniels model or the Lydiard training model. And now someone getting into the sport could skip that entirely and go straight to physiology and reactions with NIRS. In the hypertrophy training world, we're still kind of stuck in that general training characteristic phase, and we haven't really moved towards that bucket system model yet. But I think we could jump past that entirely, going straight to reactions with NIRS, and that's what I'm going to dedicate the remainder of this talk to. Right, so if we could still drive hypertrophy with as low as 30% of an athlete's 1RM, could we do it with, say, 10, 15, 20%? Where's that cutoff going to be? In a study by, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that name, where presented with some evidence that the cutoff is probably going to occur between 20 to 30% of an athlete's 1RM for most individuals, but I'd wager that that percentage could actually skew quite a bit north of 30% as well. So the crux is going to be figuring out what an individual's cutoff point is that could train with more specificity. If you can only do so many work sets for a muscle group in a given week before you push past your ability to recover, it's going to be a shame if some of that training is done in an intensity range that isn't effective for you. And I think NIRS could give us a really easy and non-invasive way of actually figuring that out without having to do all these different tests and training. So when using Moxy, we see three types of blood flow trends. We have compression outflow and return, which is going to be the first picture in the top left corner. Then we have the arrow going to venous occlusion and release. Then the second arrow pointing us to an arterial occlusion and release. So starting with the compression reaction, this is when muscle tension squeezes blood out of the muscle, and this is going to occur at the onset of tension, and it's diminished upon the release of tension. So generally this will happen sub 30% of an athlete's 1-rep max, but you see deviations up to 10 to 20% lower or higher than that based on an athlete's physiological predisposition. So an example of this would be if you're doing a leg extension at a very light weight, maybe for you 20 to 25% of your 1-rep max during a warm-up set. When you do the concentric and you flex your quad at the top, you can squeeze blood out of the muscle. And then when you do the eccentric and relax at the bottom, blood is going to come back into the muscle. The next one is a venous occlusion and release. So this could occur over seconds to minutes. And in most cases, this is going to occur between roughly 30 to 70% of someone's 1-rep max or maximum voluntary contraction. But as with the compression reaction, we can see that percentage skew quite a bit upwards and downwards. So example of what this would feel like if you're doing a set of bicep curls and you're feeling blood rush into the muscle and you're getting a pump, that is a venous occlusion reaction. And when you release the tension, blood is going to leave the muscle and that subsides. So if we think of the muscle like a hose, if you're squeezing the side that the water comes out from, all the water is coming into the hose and swelling and creating that sensation of a pump. And then we have an arterial occlusion, which is when both blood into the muscle and blood leaving the muscle are restricted. So if we're using that hose analogy, you're grabbing both sides of the hose and blood flow is plateauing in the muscle. And you can see in the picture corresponding that when that happens, oxygen depletes very rapidly if you're doing work and athletes get pushed to a point of failure. So I find it interesting that the purported effective intensity range for hypertrophy training, that's roughly between 30 and 90% of an athlete's 1RM, is largely going to overlap with the percentage of their 1RM where they get a venous occlusion and arterial occlusion reaction. And I'd even speculate that that low-end observed cutoff of effective intensity of 20 to 30% of a 1RM is actually a product of what percentage of someone's max they transition from a compression reaction to an occlusion reaction. And if we think about it intuitively, if you're at a percent intensity where you're just getting that compression reaction, you're not going to be able to fully desaturate that muscle and get the oxygen conforming response. So in order to figure out when that transition occurs, I'll have athletes perform NIRS strength assessments where they start with an unloaded lift and they build up in 5 to 10% increments of their 1-rep max for sets of 3 to 6 reps. And we'll note what percentages they get each of those reactions. So the utility of that test is going to be in its prescriptive qualities for strength and hypertrophy protocols. And if you have athletes who don't respond well to traditional strength and hypertrophy protocols, you might find that they're not creating enough intramuscular tension relative to what their heart could push through And as a result of that, they end up getting those reactions at much higher percentages of their 1 rep max than would be quote unquote normal. And as a result, their strength and hypertrophy work might look a lot different than athletes who occlude at much lower loads. So here we have a sample NIRS strength assessment. This was done by Philip Batterson, who is the physiologist at Moxy, and he did a whole article and write-up on that, which you could find in that link. So doing this test, he found for himself that he wasn't getting an occlusion reaction till roughly 48% of his 1 rep max, and he wasn't cutting off blood to the artery till high 80% of his 1 rep max. And that differs quite a bit from those quote unquote research back ranges that are based on statistical averages with a larger sample size. So one of the things that I see is athletes who have this type of physiological predisposition often need to use much higher volumes or intensities than traditional strength training protocols would warrant. A lot of people might be familiar with what people call like an NME test in strength training, where someone takes 85% of their 1 rep max back squat and they perform it for max reps. And when we have athletes do that kind of test, you see a range of anywhere from 2 reps up to 20 reps, even in trained athletes. And previously, when people would do that test, they would say it's a proxy for neuromuscular efficiency. But if you pop a Moxy on the DL and you have someone do that test with a squat, you see the athletes that only get 1 or 2 reps or 2 or 3, they usually cut off blood flow to the artery within the first rep. And of course, they're going to desaturate the muscle instantly and fail because they're not getting oxygen into the muscle. Or the athletes who could get 10 to 20 reps are just getting a venous occlusion reaction in the muscle. And that falls in line with what we see in this type of NIRS strength assessment as well. And it also gets into the concept of muscle-specific hypertrophy. Oftentimes doing tests, I'll have athletes where they have a ton of trouble gaining strength or muscle in their lower body, perhaps. In their upper body, they could gain strength and muscle mass very easily. We'll often find that they could create venous occlusion, arterial occlusion at much lower percentages in the dominant muscle groups in their upper body than the muscles in their lower body.
Hey, Evan, I'll break in here with just a couple of questions. And just a reminder, if anyone else has questions, you can submit them in the chat box. So the first one here, did you say that the intensity should be between 30% and 90% of 1 rep max? If so, that's a huge range. And I think you've commented on that since they asked the question, but maybe you can follow up a little more.
So based on the literature, if you have an athlete do a single set at 30% and a single set at, say, 90%, and both of those sets should take into failure, they're going to provide an equal hypertrophic stimulus. And of course, that's a really big range for someone. But if you think about it in terms of the mechanisms that lead to hypertrophy, because it's a very non-specific adaptation, it makes intuitive sense that the range would be that large. But what we're trying to do with these types of tests is figure out what that range is for an individual, because it doesn't always match that 30 to 90% mark.
Okay, let's see. Another comment here. Both sides of the spectrum, I think this is referring to the 30 to 90% spectrum. Both sides of the spectrum may contribute to hypertrophy with different mechanisms based on what intensity is used. Maybe you could respond to that comment. Are there different mechanisms at the low end of the 30 to 90% range than at the high end of the 30 to 90% range?
Ultimately, they will be the same mechanism in that both of them are leading to high motor unit recruitment and subsequently mechanical tension. But the way that we get to the high motor unit recruitment is different. So with that very heavy load, we're going to get maximum motor unit recruitment off the bat. Where with that very light load, we're going to get maximum motor unit recruitment through the big, long, slow back-end process of having to lose sensitivity to the calcium ions and the actin myosin myofilamentos, having an increase in peripheral fatigue, and then that leading to the increases in motor unit recruitment.
Okay, we've got one more here, and then we'll let you get back to the presentation. It says, but the muscle works almost exclusively anaerobically during heavy load contractions. Why does the venous arterial occlusion matter so much? And he says he's referring to the 85% test.
I'd make the argument the muscle is not actually working anaerobically during heavy load contractions, because both if you look at the literature, if you're using something more contemporary, like a glycogen shunt model, you're not going to have high-powered muscular contractions in a true anaerobic environment, which we would define as, let's say, 0% SMO2 in the muscle. So when athletes are using that very heavy load, what we would see is, I'll actually go back a few slides too, just so we could look at this. Even when an athlete is doing their 90% 1RM sets, they're still not at 0% SMO2. So this athlete was able to get 2 reps in at that load. On the first one, they pulled oxygen all the way down to about 10%, and on the second one, they desaturated down to about 5%. There was still oxygen in the muscle at that point, but once they occlude the artery, they're incapable of getting more into the muscle, and then they're not going to be able to perform additional reps.
All right, great. If there's more questions, go ahead and submit them in the chat, and we'll let Evan continue on with the presentation. We're at about the halfway point here.
Right, so this concept that we're talking about, it also ties into what we see with a lot of high-level CrossFit competitors. So when we're looking at elite-level competitors or CrossFit Games athletes, we see 2 primary physiological limitations, and both of them have quite different adaptation trends that come with them. So on one hand, we have what we would call the respiratory limited athlete, and generally they're going to present with really good cardiac output, great mitochondrial and capillary density, but where they struggle is that they have a weak respiratory system, which would quite literally be the diaphragm being weak or not fatigue resistant enough. So as a result of these athletes having really good cardiac output and less local muscle tension, these athletes get compression, venous occlusion, and arterial occlusion reactions at much higher percentages of their 1 rep max in those prototypical ranges. On the other hand, we have what we would call delivery limited athletes who also present with really good mitochondrial and capillary density and really phenomenal oxygen utilization, but they usually have weaker cardiac output. So for these athletes, increased blood pressure is going to limit their blood flow, and that's going to result in a low oxygen environment in the muscle and failure when the heart can't break those blockages. So as a result of that, these delivery limited athletes carry much more muscle mass relative to the respiratory limited athletes. And if we were to do some math on it, based on both these occlusion ranges and what we see in practice, if you have a delivery limited athlete and a respiratory limited athlete, and both of them back squat 400 pounds, the delivery limited athlete might get hypertrophy with as light as 100-pound squats, where the respiratory limited athlete might need as high as 180-pound squats to actually get a hypertrophy response if that set's taken to near failure. And the former loads are just way more prevalent in CrossFit. So if we look at this side by side, the top is a games level delivery limited athlete. The bottom is a games level respiratory limited athlete. With the respiratory limited athlete, you see this nice linear desaturation trend across the workout. If you told me they were doing a cyclical test like a 2K row, that would be absolutely believable. And on the top, we have the delivery limited CrossFit athlete. Every time they switch modalities, they're cutting off blood flow to the working muscle, and they have these big peaks and valleys of oxygen. And they're also the ones that get that significant hypertrophy from doing the sport of CrossFit. So it makes me wonder if we could make someone more prone to hypertrophy or hypertrophying by driving a delivery limitation. And we would do that by limiting a lot of the oxygenating training and improving their oxygen utilization in the muscle. So based on the current body of literature, it appears that the most productive sets you could do in a single session for a given body part is going to range from roughly 8 to 14 sets on average, and that's from meta-analyzing a lot of the different volume studies. So the exact volume is likely going to be a product of how close to failure you're pushing on each of those work sets, the specifics of the training plan that you're doing, individual factors like recovery, genetics, work capacity, and then someone's physiological predisposition. So it makes intuitive sense that you could only stimulate so much muscle growth in a single workout. That might be one of the reasons why high frequency training might be desirable as total training volume increases, because there's a limit to how much productive work you could do in a single session. One of the more obvious reasons for this is that you're going to get an increase in neuromuscular fatigue across the workout, and that's going to reduce muscle activation and subsequently mechanical tension. Another reason is that you're going to accumulate more muscle damage as each of those work sets are performed. So This is going to tie into that concept of repeated bouts that says the magnitude of adaptation you get from each additional work set gets smaller and smaller and smaller until doing additional work is no longer not only not productive, but it could also be maladaptive. So if the evidence points to roughly 8 to 14 sets per muscle group being the max productive volume in a single session, and that's to say it's not 14 sets total in a workout. For example, if someone wanted to do back training, it would be you could do 14 sets for that specific muscle, and then you could train other muscle groups. It still leaves a pretty big range without a ton of practical value, and it also makes us question why. Why would 8 sets be the low end cutoff, and why would 14 be the most productive sets you could do in a single workout? And could we skew that range downwards or upwards based on individual factors? And do we have a practical way of knowing what that optimal volume is on any given day, so we're wasting as little training as possible over a training week, a microcycle, a macrocycle, or training career? So one of the ways that we can do this is by monitoring SMO2. So on the left-hand side, we have a chart here. This is an athlete's response to 10 reps by 4 sets of back squat at moderately challenging intensity. In each set, you see a rapid drop in SMO2 down to roughly 10%, and that's going to indicate an increase in motor unit recruitment across the set as an athlete approaches failure. One thing to note, you can see that an athlete desaturates down to roughly the same low point on each set, and they're also able to recover to a baseline during each work set, so they clearly didn't hit that point of diminishing return. When the cell isn't in a ready state, one of the things that you're going to see is it won't be able to take up and utilize oxygen, and we'll see an increase in SMO2 during workouts that previously caused desaturation. One of the reasons for this is that myoglobin creates an enzyme that's going to increase NO2 production, and NO2 and oxygen are going to compete, and that's going to inhibit oxygen utilization. So knowing this, we can monitor set-to-set blood flow, muscle oxygenation, and desaturation trends to see when we go from being able to utilize oxygen in the muscle to no longer being able to utilize oxygen during workouts. My speculation is that the point where we can't utilize oxygen in a tissue anymore is the same point where that repeated bout effect is occurring, and we've crossed the threshold where additional training volume isn't going to be advantageous anymore. And if that's the case, then monitoring SMO2 in live time could give us the way to add an unprecedented layer of precision to try and hit that moving target of training volume on any given day that we go into the gym. So when we look at this chart here, this is 14 sets of hypertrophy training. And what we have here is a performance baseline, which is the black line going across on the bottom. That's the low desaturation point that we want to be hit on each set. Then we have a recovery baseline, which is the top red line. That's where we want oxygen to recover to on each work set. What we see is that on the first 3 sets, we get a nice desaturation down to the performance baseline. Then on the next 4 sets, we don't quite hit that performance baseline. Take an extended rest period, do an additional 4 sets that hit that performance baseline, and then all of the remaining work sets don't come anywhere near close to reaching that performance baseline. So one of the things we have to acknowledge here is that rest periods are going to influence the max productive training volume. And we could derive optimal rest periods with NIRS. If we wanted full recovery, we could use something like that recovery baseline and make sure someone's hitting it during each rest period, and that would be auto-regulating their rest. Based on the literature, we know that short rest periods of 1 to 2 minutes between sets produce less muscle growth compared to longer rest periods of 3 to 5 minutes, even when volume is equated. And this is likely going to be due to higher levels of CNS fatigue and subsequently reductions in motor unit recruitment. Anecdotally, like in this case, we also see that allowing for some extra rest could allow athletes to hit a performance baseline again when they weren't previously capable of doing so. And generally, that's going to allow athletes to do more intervals than they could otherwise if they weren't using the Moxy to auto-regulate their training, since they're going to be able to maintain higher SMO2 levels during their rest periods. We also see this with the endurance athletes we work with and with the CrossFitters. We could allow them to get more training volume in a session before they hit that point of diminishing return. But inevitably, that point will always be hit, and they will always reach a period where no matter how long they rest, they still won't be able to hit that performance baseline. So there's always going to be some balance between hitting shorter rest periods from a standpoint of efficiency and resting long enough to actually allow for a productive volume. Previously, that was a little bit more of a shot in the dark, but I think using NIRS could be a way of trying to balance those two things a little bit more. Here we have some sample training protocols for auto-regulating volume that you could do with a Moxy. One of them is a single variable auto-regulation. So for example, doing 8 reps at your 10 RM on a back squat, resting 3 minutes, and repeating until you cannot desaturate the muscle to the same extent as previous sets, or you can't reach the recovery baseline. That would be similar to that protocol on the last slide. Another one is multi-variable autoregulation. What this could look like: leg press at 315, drop O2 down to the lowest point possible without a plateau, then recover baseline. If you can't drop O2 down to the lowest level or recover back to baseline within a 10% margin of the first set, then stop the workout. There are other ways of doing this. Those are 2 simple ones that I'll often use with athletes who are hypertrophy clients. Right, and then just finishing it off with a little piece on exercise selection as well. So this is a period created by Dr. Eric Helms, and it's meant to be a graphic representation of the concepts that contribute to hypertrophy in order of importance. So up to now, all of the ways that we could implement NIRS have fallen in that second tier category: volume, intensity, and frequency. And those are going to be those big picture items. Outside of adhering to training, those are going to be the most important things to manipulate from a training standpoint. Now we're going to talk about how NIRS could assist with exercise selection, and that's going to inherently have less of a total contribution to the training process. It's also important to note that I wouldn't really use this as a standalone method. The reason that I use the word assist versus determine exercise selection is that we're really only using NIRS to refine things and make minor adjustments to an athlete's setup or movement selection, but we still want to use basic anatomical knowledge, principles of exercise selection, and common sense to choose our baseline exercises that we decide to tweak with NIRS down the line. So one of the reasons that I use this, if you have someone who's training with sufficient intensity, a reasonable amount of volume, they're pushing their sets hard, and you see their loads and reps going up week to week, which by definition is going to mean that they're not overtraining, and they're still not eliciting hypertrophy, then I would start to look under the hood and see if an athlete's actually able to desaturate the muscle. So what we're going to look at here is going to fall under the categories of intramuscular coordination and technical issues. So some things I'm looking at here would be whether or not someone can desaturate the target muscle when we put it under load. For example, if someone's doing bicep curls and they push a set to failure and they still have a high oxygen saturation in the muscle, even when they do that, then you know they're probably not actually coordinating the movement properly and getting increases in motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension on those muscles. In those cases, you could try different cueing strategies or tweak someone's setup and see if that's able to elicit changes. Oftentimes, you also have to tweak someone's exercise setup, and you could use that to create the desaturation trend that you're looking for. An example of this could be a back squat. Oftentimes you find that people, particularly those who are a little bit more prone to being respiratory limited, or they include at higher percentages of their 1 rep max, they can't fully desaturate the muscle when they're doing a back squat, because the back squat has a linear ascending strength curve. It's going to be hardest in the bottom, and it's going to get easier as an athlete goes up. But you could turn a back squat into a linear strength curve exercise by applying band resistance, so it's an equal difficulty throughout the entire range of motion. And oftentimes things as simple as that actually allow someone to desaturate the muscle fully, and it takes a standard barbell exercise that might not be as effective for hypertrophy and turns it to something that might be effective for that individual. So that's all I've got for the talk.
All right, thank you very much. We've got a comment here that will maybe you could respond to. The heart rate alone as the limiter flies in the face of mechanical fatigue evidence. What you see in the heart, therefore, might be the effect of what is reactionary at the muscle based on training experience and epigenetics, etc. Maybe you could comment on that.
I'm just going to read that real quick.
Yep. Oh, and then there's another. I'll let you read the other paragraph as well. You can probably read that faster than me reading it out loud.
So it's not going to be that cardiac output alone is going to be the athlete's limiter when we're talking about mechanical fatigue. It's always going to be the relationship between cardiac output and local muscle tension. So at some point, if you apply enough mechanical tension, compressive forces on the muscle, cardiac output won't be sufficient enough to push through that tension. And that's why you're going to see those occlusion reactions and eventually arterial occlusion when the heart can't push through the blockage. This is why athletes with very good cardiac output relative to the amount of muscle tension they can produce are able to deliver even at higher percentages of their 1 rep max.
Okay, the next question. Can you explain the relationship between motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension?
Okay, so when we increase motor unit recruitment, that is what's going to increase mechanical tension in the muscle. So earlier when I was talking about light loads and heavy loads, both leading to high mechanical tension hypertrophy, the mechanism for that is that very heavy loads are going to cause maximum motor unit recruitment off the bat, where with light loads, you're going to take that back or pathway to increase motor unit recruitment. So if you take 40% of your 1 rep max and you go to do a curl with it, you're not going to get very high motor unit recruitment for probably the first 10 to 20 reps before you drive peripheral fatigue, and that ends up leading to motor unit recruitment.
All right, great. That's all the questions I see in the chat. Just a reminder, we will be posting the recording of this online, and if you have additional questions, you can submit them when we post them in the forum, and I'll send out a link to that as well. So thank you everyone for attending and participating in the conversation. We appreciate that, and a big thank you to Evan Peikon for presenting the webinar.